I want to respond to this programme as television, rather than in relation to its architectural content. So I'm interested in the visual style of the programme and its form, the way that it addresses its audience, and in ways in which point of view are used and the relationship between the studio, where most of the programme takes place, and the location footage and other kinds of images that we see in the show. I want to look at visual composition, framing, and the editing of sequences together, and the relationship between the camera and the narrator, Geoffrey Baker, who presents the programme. My argument is that this programme has a tension between acting as a channel or relay for architectural information for the Open University's students, and also finding a form in which it can work as television within the conventions of television presentation. I think the programme is aware of this tension and that, in fact, in some ways it's about the ways in which the television medium and architecture can collide and find a relationship in terms of visual form and style. This opening sequence presents a series of graphical designs on the screen, and I think it's quite puzzling, certainly initially, as to what these things might be. But we're going to find out that they're actually architectural sketches made by Geoffrey Baker that he's going to show himself producing later in the programme. So these opening images foreshadow what happens later on, and the ways in which Geoffrey Baker actually functions as an architect creating design on screen during the programme. These images that we see, and indeed the typographical style of the opening captions, are they're hand-drawn and rather rough, slightly blurry and blotty and inky, perhaps suggesting the creativity, the handcraftedness, the artistry of being an architect, rather than the kind of the harsh industrial design side of architecture, and the detail of building, construction and materials that, of course, architecture also involves. So I think what we're being presented with here right at the beginning is an idea that architecture is at the interface between design as creativity and design as a professional, industrial kind of work.
Most of the television programmes in this course deal with outstanding works of architectural design that came into being during the period 1890 to 1939. This programme is an exception in that it deals with design as an activity, and I want to discuss the creative processes involved in architecture by explaining how I designed my own house near Newcastle on Tyne. But there's another reason for showing you this house. It was completed 30 years after our period. And it does, I think, show how architects' ideas have been completely revolutionised by developments in design techniques which took place between 1890 and 1939. To begin with, I'd like to explain the process of architectural creativity as I see it. And here a personal view is inevitable because design is a very personal kind of activity. For simplicity's sake, I'd like to separate the activity of design from the information being fed in about any problem. So I begin by talking about how we absorb and sort out the information we have. The kind of information we draw on seems to range from one's past experience of architecture in general, which I'd call an indirect source, to the information supplied in the brief, about the accommodation required, the context, and so on, which I'd place much nearer to the centre of operations. Information of direct importance to the job. Outside this area, I'd place the work of architects one admires. And between them, I would place the ideas which begin to form as part of the investigation process.
We see Geoffrey Baker, the presenter, in an undefined space at the beginning. It's not quite clear where he is. This is a TV studio. It doesn't really look like anything else than that. It's not a home. It's not an office. It seems that the TV studio represents itself. It's a space that can be anything. It's there for the programme. We can see that Geoffrey is dressed professionally in a jacket and tie, but he has relatively long hair. He's clearly wearing a coloured shirt, and he addresses us in a quite informal tone. So the programme is negotiating something about what the identity of an architect might be, I think, in the way that it offers us Geoffrey Baker as an example of an architect at work, Here he is at work in the studio. He's like us in some ways, approachable, but also professional and also expert. So already there's a kind of rhetoric about what an architect is in the way that the program opens its presentational style.
In my experience, these images are very important and direct one's search towards a solution very strongly. In the units, I've mentioned that I wanted a vernacular, cottage kind of expression, as in this Northumberland group. And also, I wanted a sense of 20th century dynamism, two images which seem to be in conflict. Whilst these basic images were always at the back of my mind, they were supported by more specific images which made a deep impression on me at the time.
What does the camera do? Well, the camera by and large serves Geoffrey Baker as presenter. It stays still, gazing at him while he speaks. When he mentions his own house, the project that he's discussing here in the program, we get a still of that location, showing us his house. When he mentions a group of cottages that partly inspired his design, the camera pans over them left to right, helpfully showing us what these houses look like. So the camera is in the service of the presenter, and it's there to enable him to make his argument in the clearest way to us. The visual style, therefore, is, I would say, quite self-effacing, doesn't draw much attention to itself most of the time, and it supports the authority of Geoffrey Baker as architect and presenter.
And I warmed to them for different reasons. One was the Sea Ranch development in California, which I'd seen illustrated. I liked it because it had some dynamic spaces which suggested freedom and informality. Another was Corbusier's Joao houses, which I'd recently visited. This was Corbusier at his most sophisticated, with a marvellously economical use of shapes and materials and the sense of grandeur that's always present in his work. Then there was Tom Mellor's cottage-type house near Blackpool, Ribby Wood. I liked it because it fitted into its context so well, with beautiful proportions, careful use of traditional materials, resulting in a very English kind of imagery. And another was an interior as depicted in a film, The Pink Panther. This was supposed to be a modern chalet in Switzerland, and it was inhabited by a girlfriend of David Niven. It had a rather splendid living space with a sunken conversation area and a large fireplace with logs burning.
The sense of authority that Geoffrey Baker gains as presenter comes, I think, in part from his articulacy about his own thought process as an architect, and how his taste, his architectural taste, is given a rationale and is explained. He tells us why he likes architectural styles from America, Europe, and in England. His taste choices are shown to have a kind of reasoned architectural justification. And he tells us about how buildings use space, materials, and their environment. There's a logical structure of argumentation that underlies what he has to say. And this kind of specialist knowledge is, of course, partly what the Open University is selling to the students on this module. And there's therefore a kind of matching between what Geoffrey Baker enacts for us, what he performs on screen in this program, and what it is that Open University students might be able to attain for themselves by taking this module. They will become more like him. And I've already suggested that I think he wants us to feel that he's kind of also like us, not too distant, not too expert for us to understand. The program softens Geoffrey Baker's knowledge, and I think one of the ways it does this is by the reference that he makes at the end of this little section about the things that inspired him, when he talks about the ski lodge in the Pink Panther, which was one of the inspirations for the design of his own house. And this links playfully outwards to popular culture, entertainment, and Hollywood, in addition to the ways in which he claims expertise by referring to famous architects, for example.
So, those are the pieces of information. And in order to make use of them, a certain technique has to be learned. Like any technique, it develops out of direct experience and knowledge of the work of others. I want to mention two aspects of technique which apply to the actual process of design. One is the way there's a constant switching from the whole to the parts, or in my case, mainly from the parts to the whole. For example, one of my basic notions was that I wanted certain activities to be possible in my living area, Let me draw them for you. First, I wanted to be able to sit around the fire.
This sketching sequence is really interesting for me because it begins with this striking change of point of view. Rather than the camera being positioned in the studio gazing at Geoffrey Baker when he talks to us, instead suddenly it is overhead in a position that's inaccessible normally to a human observer. It's a privileged kind of point of view which can show us his activity of drawing. What this point of view does is to show how the camera can master the space of the studio in a way that human performers cannot. The camera has a special ability to show us things that we wouldn't otherwise normally be able to see in this way. In the context of the A305 course, the purpose of this bird's eye view sketching sequence is to show the process of how architectural ideas take a visual form and lead eventually to a design. And of course that's part of the educational objectives of the program. But it also allows the program to thematize ideas about how we see what design is, whether we see design in terms of two-dimensional shapes, graphical designs, models, or indeed images of completed buildings, whether in photographic form or as moving images. And this sequence, I think, introduces that idea of the self-consciousness of how buildings might be represented.
And secondly, I wanted to be able to sit around the television at the same time. Thirdly, I wanted to be able to enjoy stereo. And fourthly, I wanted to be able to enjoy a view whilst doing all these things. In addition, I wanted a feeling of intimacy and privacy, with an extension of my view to something beyond the living space, rather like this.
The style of the program here becomes graphical, somewhat like an animation. It's as if we're seeing images being drawn, which will then in some way come to life for us, like seeing the artist's hand creating the images of a cartoon.
In other words, I didn't want a particularly large living area as such, but I wanted to be conscious of it extending to something beyond, an idea which derived directly from the maison's jowl. And this idea of a very specific kind of living space based on some pretty definite views which I had was much firmer than anything else in the design, although I was almost as definite about more general requirements. For instance, I knew I wanted at least 3 bedrooms and a close relationship between the kitchen and the living area and the dining area. However, the point I want to make is that one constantly ranges from particular ideas to the general and back again, constantly modifying each of them. The parts you're reasonably sure about can be juggled until everything slots into place.
As a whole, I think A305, the course itself, thematizes how TV and architecture might try to relate to each other as ideas about how space can gain meaning, and how each decision that we make about spatial design impacts on the meaning of the whole of which it is a part. And it's this point that, in fact, Geoffrey Baker goes on to make when he talks about his modifications of the standard conventions of a house being built in the UK, so that it becomes more like Le Corbusier, who he admires so much. And so what Geoffrey has done is to make a number of, some ways, relatively small decisions, as well as some big ones, which affect how space gains meaning and how the house takes shape as a completed product. So this idea of creative choices, decision-making, and how the small affects the large also, of course, applies to the ways that TV programs are made. Each individual choice of shot, of edit, each use of the relationship between sound and image has an effect on the meaning of the program as a whole. So in a way, building a TV program and building a house are not entirely dissimilar things. And I think the program works on this idea, I think sometimes consciously, sometimes not. And it's interesting to explore how the show negotiates that tense relationship between two forms, two art forms.
Now, This juggling process, the arrangement of the various knowns, brings me to the second thing that seems to happen with design. I'm always looking for combinations which provide the maximum opportunity. Experience tells me the kind of arrangements that are likely to pay off, and those which are likely not to. The standard house, of which mine was a modification, was limited. It is, of course, a fairly common kind of formula, a modern equivalent of the Georgian house. It satisfies most people's needs extremely well. If we compare it with Le Corbusier's Houses for Workers of 1924, where he breaks a single cube down in a way which allows contrasting spaces and where opportunity is created for the eye to dwell on forms and to enjoy walking up a stair, of course, you're right to say how impracticable. These houses were never built, but they do highlight the difference between Le Corbusier's approach with its concentration on visual stimuli and the traditional attitude which aimed at privacy and enclosure. But the main difference is that to Le Corbusier a house was high art, which for him meant a heightened awareness of space and shapes, whereas for most people a house is a container for living, which provides a very different kind of visual pleasure. Still on this question of technique, the way architectural elements are assembled, I was so intrigued by Le Corbusier's approach to design that I spent 4 years examining his work. And amongst the many lessons that I learnt from this were two very important points of technique. For instance, this is the monastery of La Tourette, and this shows us, I think, that light can be as positive an element of architecture as the various shapes, because if a wall or a space is carefully illuminated, it can be completely transformed. This is another building where this happens, the Villa Savoie, and we'll be looking at this later in the course. Secondly, I learnt that a circulation route can form the basis of a plan, and that movement in such a building is enhanced by varied experiences on the route. Let us return to the specific information in the brief, which is perhaps closest to the design activity. Let me remind you of some basic facts. That my lack of money caused me to modify a basic house type that was already being built. That I was restricted to a rectangle of about the same dimensions as the standard type, about 1,600 square feet overall, excluding the garage. I had to use the same materials as those in the standard house, including the type and colour of brick. And I had to use windows from a standard range. What I was doing was to reassemble an existing kit of parts. This was the context: a farm on the brow of a hill, a shallow valley containing a small river. The river, the farm and the site with its approach roads, country on one side, thinly spread housing on the other.
As the programme continues, we see a series of shots about how the house relates to its context, both its immediate local context and its wider context in the landscape. And so we see some shots panning along the street, we see shots across the fields towards the new house, and we see how the house sits into its environment. Now, of course, these are mostly there as illustrations for what Geoffrey has to say about the relationship between the built environment and nature. But they also draw on conventions of representation that I think, again, suggest a kind of tension between two modes of thinking about how to picture this question of how the house works in its environment.
The river, as is often the case, is the divider, and although it's only small, it combines with the farm to provide a rural force.
When we have pans of landscape with the river, bridge and houses in the distance, they are harmoniously framed. The camera moves smoothly across the distant landscape, rather in the way that classical paintings frame landscape and place human activity as being embedded within nature. And I think there's something of that in this rhetoric, this visual rhetoric at this moment.
This was my first sketch, and it's a very modest design, I think you'll agree. I think I was inhibited by the need to modify an existing type. It has the traditional pitched roof, and it's more an outline layout of accommodation possibilities than anything, done to show me what I could get in terms of actual rooms within the given area. And yet, as often happens, curiously it contains the essential arrangement of the final design, which I think I can explain best if I sketch it. Establishing the rectangle, we enter here, and we have the living space with a wall wrapping around here and the library in this part. The circulation route goes along here, and we're able to move through with a low wall here, and we can see across this low wall into the living space. And we go along and we descend into it by 2 steps. The fireplace was here, and we have this ledge which goes all the way round, a window here in the library and another one here. The circulation route continues in this direction, so that we have a dining space here and we have a kitchen here. We have a serving hatch joining the two, and here we have a bathroom and 3 bedrooms completing the design.
As Geoffrey continues his drawing, we see more squares, lines and shapes which divide the space of the screen into sections and different kinds of spaces. Overall, what this sketching is doing is to link the 3-dimensional space of the house that he's designing to the 2-dimensional space of the sketch, the paper that he's sketching on, and also the 2-dimensional frame of the television image. The program plays with the idea of surface and depth, therefore, because of course those flat pieces of paper and the flat surface of the television screen are quite different to the 3-dimensional space of a house, the 3-dimensional space that the camera is also sitting in its own TV studio. So there's a kind of dialogue, a tension between 2-dimensionality and 3-dimensionality in the activity of design, which the television presentation here is also replicating and exploring for us, I think.
And in this arrangement, which has this traditional pitched roof with the low ceiling, we have a hint of horizontal spatial linkage, but of course we don't have any vertical spaces. And we have the bedrooms as cell-like containers with the living spaces rather different. Now, there's a sort of circulation route along which there are some incidents, but nothing like what I really wanted. So I tried another arrangement which extended the circulation route, and I also had a series of flat roof designs which were all the time exploring the possibility of space around the central fireplace, which was something that is beginning to happen in this design. And this was an idea that had taken root and which I hung on to because I believed in it. As part of my explorations, I turned this design round so that we have the living space at this end with the library here, and having extended the circulation route so that we now come in here, we have a kitchen, dining, study, bathroom, small bedroom and 2 larger bedrooms completing the design. This began the kind of chain reaction that I was looking for, because I next tried a double pitched roof, so that instead of this arrangement we have 2 pitches, the smaller one over the front part of the design, the larger one over the rear, and down the centre, the circulation route, I was able to define this by the insertion of the studio attic.
Here at the end of the sequence, the camera returns to Geoffrey Baker's sketches on paper, and we see again shapes that repeat the square framing of the television image's composition, linking once again the subject of the program, the activity of design, with the visual style that's being used to express it, in which design and televisuality come to have an intimate relationship, sometimes one which is harmonious, but also sometimes one which can be distanced or critical of one of the other.
Which I think I can best show you on the model. And here we can see the 2 roof pitches, which if I remove them will reveal the circulation spine. We've got the possibility of a whole series of contrasts between the two roofs and the horizontal low roof of the circulation zone, and this double pitch helped to clarify the plan arrangement by separating the front and the back parts of the design. I pulled the front to one side so that it helped to separate the two forms, to clarify them, and I wrapped the garage round at the end so that the house would be a satisfactory termination to its cul-de-sac situation. The double roof pitch allowed sun penetration right into the heart of the house, and this gave a marvellous opportunity to light the central part of the circulation zone by admitting light through here, down through the funnel. And access is given by a ladder from the hall through to the attic above.
I think this little moment is the only zoom in this studio sequence, or at least the only one that I think draws any attention to itself. The camera closes up on the architectural model. Geoffrey Baker's talking about the way that we might experience a journey through his house along the circulation spaces and into the rooms. He's inviting us to imagine what it might be like to walk through this building and to experience the space. And the camera's point of view, by closing up towards the model and the spaces which it encloses, it invites us to parachute down, as it were, into that model, to imagine ourselves miniaturizing and being able to walk through this representation of what the house is going to be like. This, of course, is a form of foreshadowing again, because we're going to see a sequence walking through the real house shortly in the program. And this is another of the ways, like the graphics at the beginning of the show in the opening titles, that I think prepare us for a narrative and an argument that Geoffrey Baker has clearly built up from the word go.
And light also enters the living area in the same way, through a clear story into the living zone. The model shows us the definition of the circulation route and the incidents along it, so that as we come in here, we've got first of all the light coming down through this hole we can see up immediately into the roof. We move along and there's a squeezing in, and before we come to the spaces which are the kitchen on one side and the dining space on the other. And as we move along, we are then stopped by the fireplace, which makes us turn. We have to turn left, and we go through this tunnel into the library space, from which we can see into the living space, which is the climax of the whole movement sequence. I'd describe this arrangement around the fireplace as a pinwheel, because the spaces are all revolving around the fireplace: the dining, the kitchen, the library, and the living space. And this is another technique that had been used extensively by both Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright. And in many of Wright's designs, the fireplace is thought of, as it is here, as the symbolic heart of the house, as the nucleus. Not only do spaces revolve around it, but the low walls slot into it, and so does the studio. As we drive up to the house, we see how these ideas worked out in the building itself.
So here we drive up towards the house and discover it, as it were, seen first of all from a distance, and we're going to get closer and closer and finally go inside. This movement from left to right across the space of the street, moving towards the house, matches the left to right movement of pans that we've seen the camera perform before in the program. In fact, there are a lot of them. The one that this might remind us of most is that early pan across the Northumbrian cottages that Baker said partly inspired his design. And that movement across a brick, or I think it was originally stone frontage, makes a visual parallel between that design inspiration and this finished product.
The vernacular cottage theme seemed to me to ask for no large windows on this front, and another factor is that it's south-facing. And here we can see how the garage is wrapped round to terminate this view. These clear-story windows increase the sense of stretching and further the linear idea. This part of the design stops here, and this bedroom window marks the fact. I was using standard windows, and this almost square bathroom window has a neutral role in the composition. The kitchen window is long and gives a good view out, and takes up the general linear theme of the composition.
When we see closer shots of the doors and windows of Baker's house, moving from that wider landscape to the detail of the building itself, those doors, windows, walls, roofs, much more clearly geometrical forms, square and rectangular forms, that are very different from the open landscape and its natural curved forms that we saw in the earlier shots about the house's local environment. So I think the house in these sequences with windows and doors seems much more disconnected from that broader scene that Geoffrey has argued that it wants to connect with and to be embedded into. So there's a tension between the three-dimensional spatial depth of landscape versus the kind of flatness of surfaces and geometry, the graphical style of the house's design.
This window is deeper than the others because it's special. It's part of the library, and the shape fits between bookshelves rather well and gives a good view out from a sitting position. The doorway is an incision into the form because I wanted to take the circulation funnel idea outside. I wanted the entrance to give a feeling of penetration, so that we don't just go through a door, but we have a transitional situation that's part inside and part outside.
In addition to a panning movement that discovers the house, we move into the front door, and the zoom towards the door matches the movement of the imaginary visitor to approach the building and enter it. So the zoom is a kind of visual expression of the penetration that Baker talks about of the door into the house.
On entry, we get a glimpse of something beyond, but nearer and to the right is the ladder that leads up through the funnel or light well to the attic. It's a natural thing to move along an axis, and we're squeezed in by the walls immediately before seeing the kitchen to the left and the dining space to the right.
The camera dollies forward along the corridor of the house, probably being pushed along on some kind of wheeled device. And so we are invited to occupy its point of view as visitors to this space. This is the fulfillment in the real house of the experience of moving through it that was foreshadowed earlier by Baker's invitation to think about the model of the house and how a person might move from room to room through the circulation spaces. Here we see that come true, as it were, in real space. The positioning of the camera is very conventional as a documentary form. The camera is at head height for a human visitor to the building, and it takes the place of a kind of investigator exploring this environment. There's a narrative of discovery and revelation here as the camera takes us through the space, pans left and right to see rooms adjacent to each other as we go deeper and deeper into the building. And there are also some cuts that show us rooms that we might be able to enter. And there's a sense in which we are given access to this space and we become embodied by the camera as this visiting person being shown around, as it were, I guess, shown around Baker's house.
The kitchen fittings are hung from the walls and they're in timber, the visual warmth of wooden surfaces plays a very important part in the design of the whole house. We have a glimpse of the library, but we're squeezed in again before we move into it. And now we can see the living area from the dining zone in a sort of frame. As the climax of the movement sequence, this living space is suitably grand. It's larger and more formal than the other spaces, though in the same key.
As we move around the house, we're invited to notice the details of the space. We might, for example, notice the abstract paintings that he has on the walls, the designer furniture that we can see in some of the rooms. There's a sense, I think, overall of a kind of leisured tastefulness about this environment.
The fact that we walk down into it increases the sense of importance.
Geoffrey Baker suddenly appears walking into the living room here, and this introduces a heightened sense of intimacy, I think, which is a word that he uses a number of times around this point in the film, to talk about his intentions for the feel of the house that he wants to create. We, via the camera's point of view, seem to have become unseen guests. He doesn't appear to notice that we are present, that the camera is present within the space of his house. We are kind of ghostly, spectral spies investigating his domestic environment.
And the continuous tiled ledge helps to tie the various parts together, rather in the way that panelling used to in previous ages.
This shot of a toy castle, presumably it belongs to Geoffrey Baker's son, I think is a kind of visual joke about the Englishman's home being his castle. This is Baker's home, after all. And the model castle also might refer us back to the model of the house itself that Baker showed us earlier on when he took off the pieces of the roof and invited us to imagine walking around this model as though it were the real place. All of these parts of the film, I think, belong to a kind of rhetorical strategy that we can see working throughout it, which is to do with the ability to create, to understand, to manage, to control space. Of course, that's what architecture is, in part. It's also what building models is about, imagining what spaces might be like. And indeed, sketching, drawing designs has something of that about it too. So I think this program is in many ways preoccupied with this notion of the significance, the creation and the management of spaces, televisually as much as architecturally.
The rich red of these quarry tiles works with the timber. Le Corbusier called these friendly materials, and they're very much part of the vernacular imagery, which is a basic design idea. There are three main things happening in the design here. There are the horizontal parts, the floors, the low ceiling of the circulation route, the ledge, the low walls. Then there are the vertical elements, such as the walls, the chimney. And the two roof pitches, which are at different heights, with one large beam holding up the roof of the living area. I wanted all these things, verticals, obliques and horizontals, to come together in a kind of crescendo around the fireplace. Space is allowed to flow continuously, not only around the fireplace nucleus, but through to the studio space and back again. The tall library window is a vertical element which admits western sun discreetly in a way that doesn't disturb anyone sitting in the living area. And it seemed important to keep these timbers vertical to echo the vertical form of the chimney alongside. In the studio, we have an intimate space that's quite different from the open spaces of the living zone.
The shot of the upstairs studio that begins this sequence shows us rather prison-like wooden beams that seem to bar the viewer from access to the space, or once inside the studio, barring us from access down to the spaces below.
It adds flexibility to the house, and we use it for a variety of purposes. And here, as elsewhere in the building, I use the friendly texture of wood to create an atmosphere of warmth and intimacy.
This sequence about the upstairs studio in Baker's house is, I think, strikingly different to the ways in which the other rooms in the house have been quite carefully explained and which the viewer has been introduced to by the camera. There are close-ups of solid surfaces. There's no sense of the depth dimension of the upstairs studio or what might be inside the room in terms of which furniture there is inside of there, what evidence of the different uses that the room is put to. None of that is available to us. The upstairs studio, in fact, seems like a kind of hidden secret chamber, I think, in contrast to the intense visibility, the access that we're given to the rest of Baker's house. It's intriguing to see the studio upstairs being presented in this way. It's also, I think, rather forbidding in contrast to the voiceover, which talks about notions of warmth and intimacy in the design of the house. And yet there's this strange, unseen, hidden space at the top, a kind of Bluebeard's castle secret chamber or something, which we never really learn much about.
I wanted the house to provide viewing opportunities and privacy, two requirements which needn't be in conflict. And I think the living area demonstrates this.
This is, I think, the third time that we see this boy. Presumably he is Geoffrey Baker's son. The third time that we see him in the programme. I think his appearances are there to validate the argument for this house's privacy and yet its openness to its outside context, the surrounding environment, which we see through its windows. We see the boy peering out of the window at the camera from this enclosed space in which he stands. He's within the house and protected from our gaze, and yet at another time we see him playing in the outside, in the distance, on the banks of a small river that runs near the house. He's part of the landscape that the house wants to connect to. And finally he comes to pick up a toy from next to the model castle that we've seen in the living room of the house. This again, I think, hints at the idea of the house as the Englishman's castle, as something which is private, familial, and also needing to be defended as much as it defends the people who live inside of it. We might think of the boy in relation to the house in terms of the way that the house enables him to look out at this space through the windows, while at the same time it protects and enfolds him in this familial environment. On the other hand, though, the camera shooting through the windows at the boy as he comes to play with his castle suggests, I think, that we have a kind of access to the space which might perhaps be, if not exactly threatening, then at least invasive of the intimacy and familial warmth that Geoffrey Baker talks about in relation to his design.
The rear of the house is sheltered from the prevailing wind and has a good view. The process I've described to you has been deliberately simplified, but two things I hope emerge clearly. One is how much architects of my generation owed to Le Corbusier, and to the techniques of spatial organisation which he and others introduced during the period which you are about to study. The second is the way my thinking was affected by buildings I'd admired. These are the jowl houses, which caused me to reject the conventional approach to house design. Sea Ranch again. And during the period you're about to study, a new approach to architecture came into being. It emerged in a remarkably short period of time. Between 1890 and 1930, a relatively small number of gifted individuals, Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier are two,
The producers of A305 about architecture were the inheritors of talks on BBC Radio and more recently the emergent genre of television documentary about architecture. These things had a long history which went long before OU started making architecture shows in the 1970s. The personal view documentary, perhaps exemplified by Kenneth Clarke's series Civilization about history of art in 1969, was followed by The Shock of the New by Robert Hughes about modern art. And more recently we might think of the presenter Jonathan Meades, who makes rather quirky, somewhat surreal programs about art and architecture today. Open University programs made with BBC Two technical staff shown on the BBC Two channel in Britain exemplify tensions, I think, in what British public service broadcasting is. Public service broadcasting, so important to our national context, means programming that combines education and information and entertainment. Of course, some programs do one more than another. Open University programming is intended primarily for educational purposes, but these programs could also function as shop windows for the Open University as an institution and as a recruitment tool that potentially could bring students to study subjects that they didn't know that they were interested in until they saw the OU's TV programs. While OU programs may not ever have been popular as such, there was certainly some spillover effect that they had on the larger population, especially the programs that the OU made about the arts and programs for its foundation courses, which were much more accessible than the highly specialised ones about mathematics or physics, for example, which would also be available to any viewer, but perhaps less likely to be watched. While the Open University programming was aimed at adults, the concept of educational programming as a genre was, of course, nothing new in the UK. There had been programs for schools for decades before this for younger children. And there was already a culture of programs that might be good for you, but which were not part of any educational qualification, that were shown especially on Sundays. On Sundays in the 1970s, when these programs were made, most shops were not open. There was little for people to do, and people were looking for amusement on a Sunday in a way which they don't have to do now. So tuning into the Open University might be more likely in that context than it would be today. OU Television raised the profile of the Open University, and that's still the case now, somewhat 50 years later. There's a sense in which these programs are performances for different kinds of audiences. First of all, they are presentations for Open University students, but they also provide a public face for the institution, which is intended to benefit it and to raise its profile. We should bear in mind how these programs were scheduled and advertised. Since when they were made in the 1970s, there was really no available technology to record and re-watch programs because commercial videotape recorders only came in the early 1980s at any scale. So there weren't opportunities for people to watch these programs over and over again, except by tuning in to repeated broadcasts. So what the Open University did was to repeat the programs over and over, often over a period of many, many years, at which point, of course, they somewhat change their meaning and they become dislocated from their original context. The presenters start to look as though they're wearing comically outdated clothes. They don't meet the fashions of their time. Programs made in black and white are shown in a time when almost everything else is in colour, for example. The audiovisual style, I've argued, of the Open University's broadcast, this one in particular, is often quite deliberately self-effacing because what it wants to do is to relay information to the audience, to deliver content to its viewers. But it very often doesn't just do that. It also has a quite self-conscious rhetoric, a kind of stylishness, which does more than just deliver information.